Welcome. Today is the last session of this course, and I think we've covered a lot of really fascinating material. We focused largely on organizational dysfunctions that contribute to system failures in technology systems. We've identified dysfunctions across the board, really, in terms of the social and organizational context of large technology systems. We've looked at corporate decision making, the internal business unit management and priorities of individual firms and individual plants. We've looked at failures of safety culture. But we've also looked at governmental failures, and especially failures of the regulatory systems, which are designed to enhance the safety of our technology-intensive society. We've looked at internal regulatory failures, things which happen internal to the management of a regulatory agency like the EPA or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We've looked also at failures which are political failures of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the fact that it is vulnerable to political pressure from the Congress. We've also looked at regulatory failures that stem from the pressure to which agencies are often subject, maybe always subject, concerning the industries and the business organizations that they are established to regulate, which we've referred to as regulatory capture. If this course were taught in a department of engineering, in the College of Engineering, for example, if it were a course in the Department of Aeronautical and Astronautical Engineering at Michigan, there would have been more emphasis on technical dysfunctions in large technology systems. We might have paid a lot more attention to failures in the design process for complex systems. We might have spent more time, we did spend some time, but we would have spent more time on failures in the software control systems, which are increasingly a crucial part of system failures, as we've seen from Nancy Leveson, but we would have given those failures greater attention. We would have paid more attention to the disciplines of engineering, system safety design principles. For example, the idea of removing possible failure points whenever possible, rather than working around them, which turns out to be a crucial source of error in the Boeing 737 MAX design. In short, we would have taken Nancy Leveson's advice that system failures in technology systems always involve the social environment in which they occurred, including the kinds of organizational dysfunctions that we have studied, as well as the technical, engineering, and technological interlock and interconnections and control systems which complex technologies always involve. But what we have observed, I believe, is that safety science, if there is such a thing, must involve a multidisciplinary approach if it is to succeed in diagnosing complex accidents, and furthermore, in providing guidance about improvements in the organizations and technologies themselves so as to reduce the likelihood of serious accidents in the future. Organizational sociology clearly is an important part of the mix. And equally obvious is the fact that detailed, careful case studies, attentive both to the technical and the organizational features of an accident, are crucial. That's one reason why Andrew Hopkins' work is so valuable in the context of this course. I'd like to conclude the course by referring to a book that you didn't read, but you may be inspired to read once we've talked about it a little bit here today. And this is a book which Charles Perrow published in the last 15 years. It's a book called The Next Catastrophe: Reducing Our Vulnerabilities to Natural, Industrial, and Terrorist Disasters. This more subsequent book, more recent book, picks up a different thread than the normal accidents book. It's in the same key, but it's got a different melody. Perrow asks what large policy decisions have been made historically in the United States and in other countries that amplify the harm done by accidents when they occur. And in fact, he believes that's exactly correct in our country. The potential for an accident in a paint factory is enhanced by the fact that there is a policy and a legal environment which allows the effects of the failure to extend not to just 50 people, but to 500 people. So his analysis in the next catastrophe provides guidance about how policies could be modified so as to lessen the impact of future disasters. The kinds of disasters that he considers include natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and so forth. And it is very interesting, of course, to realize that floods and hurricanes are themselves enhanced and worsened by policy failures in the past. It is perfectly clear that climate change is leading to more and more harmful natural disasters like flooding and hurricanes. Earthquakes, thank heavens, are not affected by human activity, so far as we know, except possibly fracking. A second category of disasters which he talks about in the book are industrial systems, including first and foremost nuclear power plants, but also chemical plants, the electric power transmission infrastructure, which is alarmingly vulnerable to computer hacking and other forms of interference, and the internet itself. And then finally, he talks about the threat of deliberate attacks by terrorists intending to cause great harm to the United States by attacking high-risk targets. And he believes that our country has left ourselves vulnerable to massive disaster and massive harmful consequences as a result of policy decisions we've made in the past extending into the present. In each case, he documents that risk has been worsened by the fact that we have allowed for a concentration of both industry and population around highly risky activities. We have tolerated, or even deliberately created, a very lax system of regulation. We have, as we've seen in a lot of detail in the course already, ineffective organization of management and oversight, at least ineffective with regard to maintaining safety. And then finally, an inability on the part of Congress to enact legislation that seriously interferes with the business and private interests of major corporations, even when doing so is in the clear and direct interest of protecting the public. And these last failures are clearly the result of a failure of public policy and legislation. The chief vulnerabilities that Perrow points out in this book refer to the systematic and virtually ubiquitous fact of concentration and centralization of both activity and population in the United States. Perrow is very concerned about the concentration of concentrated urban environments within high-risk areas, including flood and earthquake zones, for example, Los Angeles or Seattle, in massive earthquake areas where earthquakes will occur, whether it's in the next 10 years or the next 100 years. And his concern is that we've permitted settlement policies and urbanization policies which allow for the concentration of many millions of people within high-risk earthquake zones. He's concerned also about the centralized power wielded by mega organizations and corporations in our society, and he is concerned about the concentration of highly dangerous infrastructures in places where it puts large populations at risk. The siting decisions of nuclear power plants is one example, but there are lots of other examples which are non-nuclear. He refers, for example, to the risk posed by the transportation of huge quantities of chlorine gas by rail car through densely populated areas. He talks about Baltimore, for example, 90 tons of chlorine gas at a time, where a rail crash or fire could lead to the deaths of tens of thousands of people in the immediate area. He talks also about the risk presented by liquefied natural gas storage and propane storage farms in areas which are vulnerable to flooding and consequently to the release or explosion of these both poisonous gases and explosive gases. He talks about the lethal consequences that could ensue from a wintertime massive failure of the electric power grid, like we had in August of 2012 or whatever it was. That was an awkward failure because it meant the loss of air conditioning, but imagine the disruption in New England of a failure in January with sub-zero temperatures. In this book, Perrow talks and discusses failures of government in great detail. The most alarming chapters of the book focus on the failure of U.S. agencies, which are chartered to effectively protect the public against massive disaster, and yet what he identifies is that these agencies fail almost completely to effectively, intelligently organize preparations that would genuinely make us safer. The coronavirus is a great example. We did have early warning systems, infectious disease systems, which were dismantled in the early years of the Trump administration for reasons which are really need to be understood better. But Perrow, writing long before the coronavirus, provides extended analysis of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, FEMA, and its performance in Katrina disaster and other disasters, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for their respective functioning, securing the country against the consequences of terrorist attack, preparing for and responding to major environmental disasters like Katrina and subsequent hurricanes, and securing nuclear power plants and spent fuel storage dumps against both accident and attack. In chapter after chapter, he documents the most egregious and frightening failures in each of these agencies. And this is not science fiction. These are documented failures which have occurred in each of these regulatory scope. He makes careful, detailed reviews of the effectiveness and consistency of government agencies and the regulatory legislation that have been deployed to contain risks, and then asks the question, why was FEMA such an organizational failure from beginning to end in Katrina? He asks, what's wrong with the Department of Homeland Security? Why can it not do a better job of carrying out its mission? He asks why there are chronic issues of system safety in nuclear power plants and chemical plants which are not adequately addressed by corresponding regulatory agencies. And then he tries to answer those questions. He goes through each of the examples in great detail and demonstrates the very ordinary mechanisms, many of which we've already talked about in this course, through which organizations lose effectiveness. Here's a nice quote from the next catastrophe. This is from Perrow, of course, we should not expect too much of organizations, but the DHS is extreme in its dysfunctions. As with all organizations, the DHS has been used by its masters and outsiders for purposes that are beyond its mandate, and the usage of the DHS has been extreme. One major user of the DHS is Congress. While Congress is the arm of the government that is closest to the people, it is also the one that is most influenced by corporations and local interest groups that do not have the interest of the larger community in mind. This is a key finding of the next catastrophe. He goes on in a different passage, but what if FEMA were given a mandate to deal with settlement density, escape routes, building codes, and concentrations of industrial and hazardous materials in vulnerable sites? We would need a change in our mindset to make basic vulnerabilities such as the size of cities in risky areas and the amounts of hazardous materials in urban areas as high a priority as rescue and relief. In other words, the redesign of the urban landscape to ameliorate possible future hazards is an enormous undertaking, and he is frankly doubtful of our political will to do it. His central point is a stark one. The American political system appears to lack the strength to take the long-term steps it needs in order to mitigate the worst effects of natural or intentional disasters. And these disasters are inevitable in our future. He argues that we need consistent investment for long-term benefits. We need effective regulation of powerful actors who resist regulation, and we need long-term policies that mitigate future disasters. But so far, he finds we have failed in each of these areas. Private interests are just simply too strong, whether it's in land use or in regulation of chemical and nuclear industries. There is an ideology of free choice and virtually unrestrained use of property that leads to dangerous residential and business development. Think here of the building of casinos and hotels along the Mississippi River in flood zones. And federal and state agencies lack the political will to enact effective regulations that would be necessary to raise the safety threshold in dangerous industries and developments. It's very significant that the Chemical Safety Board has no enforcement power. It is merely an investigative agency after the fact. And of course, the determined attack on government regulations, which has been underway since the years of Ronald Reagan and his presidency, 1980 and forward. This attack has just further worsened the ability of agencies to regulate these powerful businesses, including nuclear power, chemical industry, oil and gas, and so forth. You might imagine that the risks that Perrow is describing here are just universal. They're just part and parcel of a complex technological society. But Perrow believes that the US has a very specific problem of technology disaster, which other countries have to some extent escaped, and especially European countries. He notes, for example, that the Netherlands has, for centuries, been able to invest in and to regulate developments having to do with the control of water, which is quite rational given that much of the Netherlands lies under sea level. European countries more generally have managed to cooperate on the management of rivers and floodplains, and most have much stronger regulatory regimes for high-risk technologies and the infrastructure of their societies. So, what to do? We need to improve the organizations that we create, both public and private, aimed at mitigating large risks. It is just inescapable from what we've learned in this course that we need to make these improvements in organizations. We need to substantially improve upon the reach and effectiveness of the regulatory systems that govern these activities. But Perrow is very doubtful about the ability and even the capacity to make these improvements. He thinks that even the marginal improvements in regulatory systems that we may be able to create can only take us so far. And so he argues for something more radical. He believes that we need to mitigate the scope of damage. We need to reduce the scope of damage that will occur when disaster strikes. We need to design our society for soft landings when disasters occur. Fundamentally, his advice is to decentralize dangerous infrastructure and to be much more cautious about development in high-risk zones. Now, if this sounds like crazy utopian thinking or dystopian thinking, the kinds of things he's talking about have, for example, to do with the routing of dangerous rail shipments of chlorine gas. It is possible to reroute chlorine gas shipments around urban populations, but it adds cost to transportation. And so far, industry has been unwilling to do that, but it is perfectly possible for law and policy to mandate that dangerous cargoes like chlorine gas should not be routed through Chicago or Baltimore. Quoting from Perrow, given the limited success we can expect from organizational, executive, and regulatory reform, we should attend to reducing the damage that organizations can do by reducing their size. Smaller organizations have a smaller potential for harm, just as smaller concentrations of populations in areas vulnerable to natural, industrial, or terrorist disasters present smaller targets. Reduce the size of the target. And if owners of dangerous activities are forced to assume more responsibility for decisions they make about design and location by being required to purchase realistically priced flood or earthquake insurance, for example, if luxury hotels needed to purchase flood insurance which was priced at the real risks which they encounter, then there would be less new construction in hurricane alleys or high-risk earthquake areas. Rather than integrated mega organizations and corporations providing goods and services, Perrow argues for the effectiveness and the feasibility of networks of small firms. We don't necessarily require an Amazon to do all of our online purchasing and delivery, for example. Perrow also argues that regulations and law can be designed that give the right incentives to developers and home buyers about where to locate their businesses, reflecting the true costs associated with risky locations. And here again, the point about flood insurance is very relevant. Our policies and regulations should make systematic efforts to disperse dangerous concentrations of industrial and nuclear materials whenever possible. When you drive south from Boston and you see the beautiful tanks decorated with beautiful paintings on, I think it's Route 3 heading south, just be aware, these are natural gas storage facilities which have enormous explosive power. So what is the upshot? The upshot of today's discussion and also the course, the Ford School is a school of public policy. Most fundamentally, the goal of public policy is to contribute to enhancement of the public good. The materials that we have studied this semester suggest that there is much to do on the side of government action, on the side of public policy, to address the rising risks of a complex, technological, and heavily populated society. And so my closing words to you are, good luck, go and do that good work. Thanks for being a part of this course this semester.